Well, it's a very exciting time for all of us who work in Cuba policy. I think it's an understatement to say that on our behalf, the members of the America Society and Council of the Americas Cuba Working Group were extremely pleased with the President's announcement on December 17th and the swift implementation of regulations that followed just a month later, especially as it relates to the topic of this panel, Cuba's growing entrepreneurial sector. I'm really pleased to have two experts join us. You guys, Ted Henken and John McIntire join us for this panel. Yes. And, you know, we have, as many of the groups have in this room, really advocated for the use of presidential authority to allow for the U.S. private sector and civil society to build direct relationships in Cuba to help advance dialogue, to help advance market reforms and economic development, and particularly to help advance the development of this private entrepreneurial sector in Cuba. Whether, you know, on our 3 trips that we've taken over the past couple of years, when you're walking the streets of Havana or Santa Clara or Camagüey, it's really, you know, difficult not to trip over the construction sites for private restaurants or see these storefronts offering cell phone repairs, manicures, haircuts, or colorful artwork. And I've really been fascinated by all of the enterprising and innovative individuals that we've met that make up now close to the 500,000 and growing legally registered cuento propistas in Cuba. So we, our two experts here today, I think, will give us a really interesting perspective on the policy end of this from a U.S. and Cuba perspective, as well as some fascinating insights on what's really happening on the ground and some success stories from these entrepreneurs themselves. Ted Henken is joining us from Baruch College, and he just co-authored a book, Entrepreneurial Cuba, A Changing Policy Landscape. He is a Cuba expert and a frequent commentator on the issue, and we're so happy to have you with us today. And John McIntire is the chairman of the Cuba Emprende Foundation that supports the Proyecto Cuba Emprende on the ground on the island. It's a program that offers training and advisory services to Cuban entrepreneurs who wish to start or improve a small business, and the Assistant Secretary of State mentioned it as well in her comments. So we're happy to have you, John, with us today as well. So the idea for this session is I want to address a few questions to John and to Ted, and then I really want to try to open it up and have, I hope, some time for question and answers from you all. So start teeing up your questions. Ted, let's start with you. I think in terms of the policy context, let's look at the Cuban side first. What legal, bureaucratic, and ideological obstacles has Raul Castro's government overcome to encourage entrepreneurship in the past 4.5 years relative to policy under Fidel, and what obstacles still remain?
Well, great. We talk a lot today about December 17th, which is a really important date, but I think it's a more important date for the United States, even though it's going to have big repercussions for Cuba. Why do I say that? Because I think that Cuba has already had 2 of its own moments over the past, let's say, 25 years. There was an experimentation with self-employment and a slight opening towards the market and the private sector under Fidel Castro in 1993 to 1996, although it kind of peaked in about 1997, and then there was a slow but sure kind of strangulation of that opening, a kind of march backwards in terms of that opening, and a re-emphasis of ideology. And then you have the takeover of Raul Castro, and after he's consolidated his rule, I think in 2010 was another really important moment, the second half of 2010. We've heard a little bit about that today. Let me just add an anecdote to get to the good things policy-wise that Raul has done, but the kind of lay the groundwork for some of the complaints that are still there. And I like to tell this anecdote because it really, Cubans are excellent at capturing a complex, difficult, often frustrating experience with un dicho, with a little saying. And Cubans have 2 of them that I heard a lot when we interviewed the entrepreneurs. One is, and those of you in the audience who know this can maybe finish it for me. El ojo del amo engorda el ganado, or el caballo, right? The eye of the owner fattens the horse. I love telling that joke or telling that saying, but especially in a place like this, people will be really receptive to it because they know what the Cuban is talking about. The second one is even better given the pressure in Cuba to downsize the state sector and expand the non-state sector, what we like to call in the United States the private sector. And this saying is a little bit more complicated, and it rhymes. El que tenga tienda, que la atienda. Y si no, que la venda. Right? If you have a store, tend to your store. If not, sell it. Maybe that person who you sell it to will tend to it. And so these are the complaints in kind of rhyme form, right, that I heard often from entrepreneurs. They were very grateful and happy about the few steps that Raul had taken, expansion of the list, right, from 178 to 201. But they were like, well, why do we need a list anyway, right? So there's good and there's bad. You can hire employees for the first time in the private sector in Cuba since 1968. Great thing. But there are some onerous taxes if you hire more than 5, disincentive to employment. So you have steps forward, you have steps backward. I call this the Raul Castro economic mambo. There's some promise, and then there's some retreat. There's pause, right? There's delay, right? He says, con prisa, con pausa, right? He mixes this because there's ideological or political logic behind his actions, but thankfully there's also economic logic that's behind his actions. So this is kind of maybe a good way to start the conversation about some of the good things that they have commented on, but some of the things they feel still straitjacketed on.
Great, and I think that's a great segue, John, to getting a little closer look on the ground and what's happening on the ground with entrepreneurs. So first, just briefly describe to the group here what Cuba Emprende is and how it was established, and then if you could tell us a little bit about the most successful areas that you're seeing in Cuenta Propismo and why perhaps they're doing better than other licensed activity, but what obstacles still exist, as Ted touched on as well.
Sure. Well, just first of all, very briefly on Cuba Emprende in terms of what it is. It started, first of all, in 2012, just post the economic reforms, so there was great need for entrepreneurs who were suddenly legalized to actually attain the knowledge to run their businesses, and there's really no way for them to do that. So a little bit of happenstance, but a small group of Cuban Americans, including myself, partnered with the Roman Catholic Church of Cuba, as well as an NGO in Mexico called Pro Empleo, who has been devising this curriculum and operating model for 20 years very successfully in Mexico. So we didn't go reinvent the wheel. We basically took the Pro Empleo model and localized it in Cuba. So what is it? In summary, it's an 80-hour training program over the course of a month that teaches all the basics of how to run a small business. That's sort of the funnel, which takes in most people, and 70% of the people are happy with that. But to those who successfully complete it and then also turn in a business plan and want additional services, especially if they're starting a business or want to accelerate a business they already have, we then have specialized services and we assign a team of people to help them over months. So, and then on top of that, we do continuous education programs every week. We have now a module on non-agricultural cooperatives. So we're trying to update constantly, the amount of information and training that we can share. So I'll stop with that. That's the basics of the program. We're operating in Havana, in Cienfuegos, and in Camagüey. We've been opening sort of one city a year since 2012. About 1,500 people or so have gone through the program. Anyway, but in terms of the second part of the question, I'll point to two fairly obvious areas of activity, but I think they're, in addition to being historically successful and currently successful, I think their potential is even greater now for a couple reasons. And those are the paladares, of course, the private restaurants, and the casas particulares, the B&Bs or the private hotels. From a pure license point of view, if you looked at the 483,000 licenses, I think the latest number I've seen, you say, well, paladares are only 1% or less, and the B&Bs, the casas particulares, are maybe 10, 12%. And so you say, well, it doesn't look like it's all that significant. But the reality is, first of all, there's a whole category of contractors that are unassigned to any particular level or type of activity, which are about 20%. Most of those work in one of those two activities. So if you add it all up together, it's probably 35% of the licenses. But beyond that, their impact is much, much greater. They're actually very complex organizations. I mean, given the lack of wholesale markets in Cuba, the lack of ability to import directly supplies and equipment, whole supply chains and networks of people have to be established to set up and to support the larger paladares and casas particulares. So there's dozens and dozens of people employed in the larger ones, that, most licensed, some unlicensed, family support, et cetera. So in terms of the actual wealth creation and employment, they far sort of outpunch their weight in terms of just, if you just look at licenses and so on. So they're continuing to do very well. And so looking forward, Ted mentioned that there's been these waves of relaxation of restrictions that allows businesses like this to thrive, followed by periods of more restrictions depending upon the macroeconomic environment. This time, I think it may be different for these two types of businesses for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that the state seems to have actually made a strategic decision to exit the restaurant business. Not entirely, but many, certainly the money-losing ones. I mean, they realize that, it's not, there's no particular reason the state has to be involved in restaurants, especially if the private sector can do it more successfully. And so they're actually handing over quite a few restaurants to either cuentapropistas or to cooperatives. And so the threat of potential future pressure from the state sector in the restaurant business is less than it has been historically. You'd agree with that. And in terms of the casas particulares, it's simply a matter of supply and demand. I mean, with the tourism boom that's already underway, and I think only number I've seen so far this year, I think January is 16% up over last year, but that was before, the recent American increase in visits. And, the Canadians and the Europeans, the traditional tourists, who of course read the headlines and now realize, that the Americans are coming, and are coming, more and more, are trying to really get back or come for the first time before they get displaced and prices go up, et cetera. So I have no doubt the tourism numbers are going to be pretty spectacular these months and going forward. And Cuba has a stock of hotel rooms of 65,000. It's not, certainly will increase over time, and there are some hotels being built, but it's nothing like what is going to be needed to manage this numbers of people. I've heard numbers of 150,000 rooms being required, over the next 3 to 5 years. So anyway, it's that wave is going to be largely absorbed, I think, by the casas particulares, and they're in a great position. And of course, both of these are convertible currency businesses, so the amount of revenues that they're earning as a percent of total revenues being earned by the so-called private sector is very disproportionate. I think they're very well positioned, to move forward. The challenges are obvious ones. I've mentioned the lack of wholesale markets, the lack of being able to import directly, the taxes on labor over 5 people. And I'll just touch on the tax thing briefly, which Ted's book goes into in great detail, and it's fascinating. But if you look at the individual taxes that they have to pay, in isolation, each one looks fairly reasonable. But the way they work together, and especially the inability to deduct more than 40% of your costs to determine your taxable income, is very, very difficult to actually fully report your revenues and actually try to make any money. Because basically what it's assuming is that you're earning a 60% operating margin on your business. That's the only way you'd get to that level. And businesses like restaurants and hotels don't work at 60% operating margins. So that's the single biggest probably challenge from a fiscal point of view anyway.
Right, and I think this comes out of a mentality where the government doesn't trust the private sector to be honest, and then the private sector doesn't trust the government to be honest, and so you have this kind of unvirtuous cycle, and there needs to be, some smart policy made that, requires compliance with the law and with taxes, but makes those at a level that are compliable. Actually, the tax system has been improved twice under Raul, but it still has this problem where there's an arbitrarily declared limit of deductions that then feeds the informal economy, the black market, people going into that. In Cuba, they have socialismo, but they also have socialismo. And it's almost always better to have a friend, have an associate where you can get things than to follow the rules. And if they change the rules so the rules are, you can survive, you can make a profit by following them, then that culture of relying on your friends will, I think, slowly give way to a more, rule of law, a culture of compliance. But that's going to be a long learning curve.
Absolutely. I think it's difficult to be an entrepreneur in any country, and what we're seeing in Cuba is that they're just up against a lot more obstacles. Ted, let's revert back to the U.S. policy side now for a moment. What, in your opinion, is new and encouraging in terms of U.S. policy vis-a-vis trade with Cuban entrepreneurs since the December 17th announcement by Obama?
Right. Well, I was very happy, like many of the people in the audience, on December 17th. But they always say the devil's in the details. Well, Roberta Jacobson was right. Those details were produced rapidly, quickly for government bureaucracy, especially given that there was a Christmas break in between the announcement and the release of those regulations. And there was feedback. You know, the government, the State Department reached out to various people to get their feedback on, you know, how should we do this. So the list that came out in terms of import and export to and from the private sector in Cuba was both underwhelming on one sense, but then if you look closer at it, there were some, let's say, silver linings. And so why was it underwhelming? Well, let me first start by, since Roberta may be listening, I want to start by complimenting the list by saying that instead of following the Cuban government's plan of action, which is to give a list of everything that you can do with the assumption that if it's not on the list, it's illegal. The United States government had a negative list, which means that they gave a list of what is prohibited, hoping to encourage people to be inventive, to think outside the box, and encourage, I think, and incentivize the Cuban government to make further reforms. I think that's one very positive aspect to the reforms that Obama is making, is that it can be read by the Cuban government. If it's done in one way, like a Trojan horse, they're going to use entrepreneurship to get regime change by other means, or it can be more of an encouragement to bring down the tension and encourage deeper reforms. But if you look at what's prohibited, there's a long list of things, of products that Cubans make in the private sector that can't be exported to the United States, even with Obama's gesture. The silver lining, I think, is in some textiles, but especially in services. There are virtually no restrictions on services, and some of the most interesting self-employed categories in Cuba legally, computer programmer, translator, telecommunications agent, and some others, can be services. And I think that there's great potential for example, Miami entrepreneurs to offshore a lot of their back office work. People who are talented, have computers in Cuba can do this work. One thing that needs to happen, and they're working on it, we heard just this week, is that internet penetration and speed needs to improve, because if you're going to hire someone on Cuba to do something and you need them to send it back to you by internet, they need to have a reliable internet connection. So I would say that's the positive and some of the downside to that. Obviously, as was said before, Cuba needs to be delisted from the state sponsors of terror, because that is, in my opinion, a political designation, not one that's based on, and I hope the evidence will show this in the next couple of weeks. And then there's also the embargo that I think Obama's trying to make foreign policy and economic policy, but he's got one hand tied behind his back. He's doing good, but you know, if he could use both hands, but since Helms-Burton is still a law of the land, he's restricted, and Congress has that power.
Absolutely, and I think that is a great segue, John, into the next question. Ted is mentioning professional services, and I think that's a real potential area for growth. So tell us a little bit about maybe some of these services and some of the very successful private businesses that we might not be hearing as much about that you see to be successful in the medium and long term.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect segue. I mean, as Ted mentioned, I think there's half a dozen or maybe 10 at the most professional service licenses among the 201 authorized categories. And I'd say right now of those, computer programming is the one that, you know, at least from a Cuba Emprende point of view, we say taking off the most. I mean, we've graduated at least 75 or 80 programmers through our program. I think stepping back, I mean, Cuba right now is an 80% services economy. It has a very well-educated population. You know, the fact that 95% of the authorized occupations are low-skilled subsistence occupations is a crazy situation, right? So this is a country that produces a lot of professionals that aren't outside of the medical profession, aren't sort of finding a productive way to use their talents for the most part. So that to me is the future. So not only the ones that are permitted, but architects, engineers, media consultants. I mean, you name it. Lots of things that could band together to produce businesses. So how's that going to happen? I mean, either hopefully the license categories will get expanded to include those at the Cuentropista level, or there's a promising but still very early development with the structure of non-agricultural cooperatives. I mean, for those of you who don't know, those were approved in late 2012, I think, Ted. There's about 500 of them approved so far, but they're very much concentrated in transportation, in construction, and in food service. But these are basically partnership-type structures. They're legal entities, so they can be scalable businesses. They enter into contracts and can borrow money and so on. Right now, they're very sort of specifically defined as like-minded people who associate with themselves, sort of, picture of a law firm, basically, or people coming together. Each person's supposed to be individually equal in terms of their contribution and their share of the profits and so on. So it's a little bit simplistic and idealistic, but at least it seems to form possibly the core or the basis for what could be scalable mid-sized businesses of professionals. And so we're going to watch the progress on that. As I say, about 500 have been approved. There's hundreds still under review. I don't think there's been a pure professional services cooperative approved yet, Ted?
No.
Has there?
One thing that I wanted to add, and maybe in the Q&A you can help us out with that, because that would be interesting to learn more about some of those. One of the things that's important, I think, when you try to understand the logic behind the reforms that Raul has undertaken, and you read the law and you talk to people, and you're reading the tea leaves to figure out, well, is there a plan, is there a method to this madness? If you read a couple weeks ago in the New York Review of Books, Enrique Krause had an essay, The New Cuba. It was a book review, but in the book review, he translated cuentapropismo, or cuentapropista. And I had never seen it translated like this, but I thought it was very interesting how he translated it. He called it on-your-own-ism. On-your-own-ism. So I think that there's a certain logic behind what the government is doing. Is not about economic growth, but it is about abandoning the commitment it had to full employment, and in some ways, it's a new day in Cuba, and there's a new social contract in Cuba. I mean, Raul has said very openly, Cuba cannot be the only country in the world where you can live without working. He's criticized egalitarianism. He calls egalitarianism the exploitation of the good worker by the lazy worker, right? He sounds like a CEO, right? And so I think that mentality is what gave birth to this thing called self-employment, what we like to call entrepreneurship. There are people who are entrepreneurs who are self-employed, but there's a lot of people who are on their own in many ways. They're surviving. I think that the Cuban government really wants to use, or would like to use, the non-agricultural cooperative sector as its middle-sized sector, because it's maybe more politically or ideologically palatable, but they've been very slow at approving those, and there seems to be a lot of bureaucracy, even though the law is written where they have potentially to be real cooperatives, unlike the experiments they've had in the past in agriculture, that they have cooperatives that don't really function well, like production, or like cooperatives because they're not democratically run, etc. So,
well, thank you. I'm getting the word that we actually have to wrap up the session, so we won't have time for question and answers, but I do encourage all of us. There's a number of coffee breaks and lunch, and so, come talk to us, come talk to Ted and John after this to further the discussion on entrepreneurship. So I just want to give a huge thank you to Ted and John for joining us and providing us with your insights.